Welcome, everyone, to the Canadian Ecopsychology Network monthly virtual gathering. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network. Today, I am pleased to facilitate a presentation by Amy Sugeno. Amy is a clinical ecotherapist. She worked as a wildlife biologist for over 16 years before becoming a social worker and a trauma ecotherapist. She has offered ecotherapy to clients for almost 10 years and has over 100 hours of clinical ecotherapy training. Amy has trained over 130 therapists in the Austin, Texas area and throughout the eastern US. She offers a variety of programs and classes to both clinical and non-clinical groups, including mindfulness and nature walks for her local community. Welcome, Amy. Thanks so much for sharing your time and wisdom today, and the airwaves are yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm realizing I don't have my computer clock up, so if you could help me if I start to, or maybe let me know when I have like 5 or 10 minutes left or something, so I don't just start wandering off somewhere.
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to speak about nature as a co-therapist. And hopefully there will be something from this presentation that will be interesting to people, or that you could maybe take into your work, or just to get something, thinking, something to think about as you're starting to do your ecotherapy, or maybe already you do ecotherapy. Okay, let's see. It's not... having trouble. There we go. Okay. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit of history, and I tried to just piece this together as best as I could. Where did this concept of nature as co-therapist, which it seems to me is what's right, if there is a model as far as a clinical model with how to work with clients that gives us something. I'm hearing this more and more about nature as a co-therapist, to give us some kind of container or something in our head to work with. And so from what I can tell, this idea began with Ronan Berger back in 2006. And Ronan Berger is an Israeli psychologist who founded the Nature Therapy Center. And he has published a bunch of really interesting papers. And in some of his papers, there's one called Beyond Words, Nature, Therapy, and Action from 2006. Some interesting quotes. He says, "A therapist can relate to nature as an active partner, perhaps a co-therapist, influencing not only the setting, but the whole therapeutic process." And then he goes on to say, "The therapist is invited to develop a specific standpoint by which he may take a central position working directly with the client relating to nature, or take a quiet role in the background, allowing the client to work directly with nature as the therapist remains as a witness, a container, and a mediator." And so he really brings in this idea that not only that clients can, we can work with nature to facilitate the therapeutic process and healing and growth, but also if it's appropriate, we can take a back seat and take a quiet role and provide a container and maybe some guidance if needed, to be able to, for clients to be able to work with nature however that might be in front of them. And then Berger also emphasized the importance of carefully choosing spaces for ecotherapy work, and he called them sacred spaces, which I think for most of us who work with clients, I think that our indoor offices, we can say, feel sacred space, or the work feels sacred. And so this is the same idea, I think, except we're putting this out in nature, and maybe it even takes on a bigger, deeper sort of meaning in nature. And we're going to talk a lot more about spaces throughout this whole presentation. And so then expanding and deepening this, the next one I found was Martin Jordan, building on Berger's work in his great book, Nature and Therapy. "It is through the natural world," he says, "that the therapeutic process is facilitated. Nature in this sense acts as another presence, which both guides and provokes the therapeutic work." And so he wrote so well, I think not only in his book, but probably different articles too, he really talked about nature as a third space, which is a presence. And so you almost get this feeling that just as if you would have a human co-leader, that nature is a presence all around us, right next to us, however it might feel for you or for the client. But there's this third space. And so both the client and the therapist, which to me is really, really meaningful, that we as therapists are also supported. We're also a part of this third space. We're supported in affect regulation, emotional expression, and digestion of material, especially when that material is difficult. So when a client is talking about something that's, maybe a sexual abuse or something that's just really important and also really difficult to hear, difficult to feel in your body, or difficult to hold, that nature is also there for us. As we're working with the client, we can also look out to the trees or breathe in whatever smells are in the air. We can tap into that as well. And then he talks about nature as a democratic space where the power differential is lessened, and the space is equally shared. So compared to our offices, where we can make it as welcoming as possible in our offices, but it's still our artwork or our furniture or colors scheme or whatever. But in nature, the therapist and the client, neither of us owns or has any more right or not right, to be out in nature. So it's a very democratic, equally shared space. And of course, also a living space. Very different from being indoors. When you're working with nature, as you know, if you've worked outdoors with clients, well, down here in Texas anyway, a snake might go right through the space, or butterflies might come through, or you start to see the thunder clouds building, so it's a very living, dynamic, constantly changing sort of space. So he says, when in context of an outdoor natural space, both therapist and client are located in a space that is dynamic and unfolding, possessing vital qualities that offer opportunities both for further understanding and for exploration in the therapeutic work. So if a particular, say, butterfly, flies in, and particularly if your client notices this brings in a whole new avenue and a whole new energy for exploring something, whatever the client might say about that, or maybe you notice something and you say something, but it brings something in that you couldn't necessarily predict that was going to happen. And that's certainly something that couldn't happen indoors, of course, a butterfly flying through your office, I guess. And so you can see this is Big Bend National Park. If you've been there before, this is the trail that's above the window trail. So this is like a little window. And where I'm standing taking that picture is up in kind of like up in the mountains. It's forested, it's cooler, but then this window that looks out, if we could actually get closer to that window and look way out, that's all desert out there. It's dry, hot, vast desert. And so if I'm sitting there, if I was working with a client right here, you can just imagine how we've got these hard rocks. We've got on the left side of the screen, there's a sotol, a kind of yucca with all these barbs up and down the leaves. We've got this vast sky. The vultures are often flying by, the vast desert. I mean, we have so much energy and then smaller energies of like that sotol plant or these rocks. So this is a really rich place to bring in nature as a co-therapist. What would a client say if you were to ask question, something along the lines of all that we can see? You can imagine the wind coming, dry wind across your face, the smells of the plants or the rocks. What do you notice? What catches your eye or what catches your attention? And then the client might say something about the sky or the rocks or the desert or something. And so you can really invite that in, whatever the client is saying, and really work with that. What is it about the rocks that really seems to be catching your attention right now? Perhaps the client might say, they're so solid. And that's what I need in my life. I really need solidity. I need grounding, something like that. And so also Jordan's third space, he talks about different spaces supporting different affective processes. So if you think about going back to Big Bend, imagine what that would feel like to be in that space. It's probably kind of hot. It may not be too hot, but it's very dry, it's very vast, it's very strong, all these rocks and you're up high. That's one particular space, and you can imagine what that would feel like for you as a person, which may or may not be how your client feels about it, but you can just imagine what that space, if you were the client, what would you feel like you could share with a therapist? Would you feel like you could talk about your depression or your grief? I don't know. Or would you feel like you could talk about your strengths, or you could talk about, whatever it might be, your trauma? Or moving on to some other spaces, this is in Western North Carolina, up in the higher elevations of the Appalachians. This feels like a really different space, right, than Big Bend. Obviously, very different, very green. It's more like kind of dark in the forest. So this would bring up, I think, for clients, a very different feeling and a very different than affective process. They might experience their emotions or their thoughts, or different things might arise in what they want to talk about, content, than might arise in, say, Big Bend. This is just down the road, one of my favorite places to go hiking and bird watching. It's called Balcones National Wildlife Refuge. And this is in the Texas Hill Country, where we've got green sort of hills, and it's semi-desert, semi-arid, but we do have some green. But you can see there's this wonderful live oak tree with this great big, beautiful branch. If we were sitting on this bench, this big, beautiful branch that's over us, we've got this nice view of the hill. If we could get up on top of that hill, we would have a completely different view. Or if we went down the slope, there's a beautiful little creek down there. So that would be different, all these different spaces. And this is Enchanted Rock, also in the Texas Hill Country. This is a granite, huge granite. I think it's one of the largest granite domes in the world or something. And this granite is very, very ancient. It's very ancient. To me, it feels like when I hike there and I take my shoes and socks off, it's like all these grandfathers and grandmothers and elders around me. It's so wise. It's just it's been there for such a long time. And you've got this amazing view. And so imagine what that would feel like sitting next to a client, what might come up in their content or in their nonverbal language, or just in their, I guess, energy, just in their affect. This is a stock photo, so I don't know where it's from, but it's really pretty. But just to illustrate that sitting next to water, or standing or walking next to water, or in all this beautiful fall color, what would this bring up for a client? How does this space feel like to you? So I think that's what he was talking about, with different spaces bringing up and supporting different affective processes. So if you're working with a client who is going through a lot of, let's say, depression, but they're having a really hard time maybe talking very much about that, maybe you wouldn't want to go into a space that's like big, wide open, because maybe that would feel so exposed. But maybe a spot like this, nestled under a little one of these trees next to the pond, that might be a really great space perhaps for that client to be able to feel like that they can unfold some of what's going on, because it feels, maybe you would feel more protective or just more placid with that very calm water. And then finally, with Jordan's third space, he creates this idea of a therapeutic triangle or triad. So instead of the dyad that we learn about in graduate school, the client therapist, we have a triad. We've got nature, the therapist, and the client. And so he goes on in his other book, Ecotherapy Theory, Research and Practice, which came out just a few years ago, a really amazing book. And he talks about how nature is an analytic third. So therapy expands to include both a therapeutic dyad and the third space of nature, which either forms a backdrop to the therapy or situates itself in the foreground of the work, taking the form of powerful metaphors and symbols. We'll talk a little bit more about metaphors in a few more slides, but you can see here on the left, this is like a stock photo, but this little group of kids and this teacher, and you can see that they're very actively getting in there and exploring and looking, and And then on the right side, this is, I think, also out at Big Bend National Park. Anyway, but you can see what a metaphor this would be. If you're walking or you're sitting and a client says, whoa, that scraggly tree all by itself on the top of that ridge or whatever that is, and all those rocks, that's how things feel for me right now. Oh my goodness, well, can you say more about that? Or they might pick something different in the landscape. But that would be, like, to me, a really, in fact, I had a client do that one time with a different tree, but it was the same kind of thing where the tree was like all by itself up on the top of this hill. And to my eyes, it looked very lonely, but I asked her about it. And so she was able to talk probably for 5 minutes about what that felt like for her, that particular tree. And then finally, and I don't know if I never know if am saying her name correctly, but Caroline Brazier, I hope that's correct, deepens Jordan's and Berger's concepts even more in another just fantastic book put out, I guess, just last year, Ecotherapy in Practice, a Buddhist model. She explores the therapeutic triangle and the therapeutic container in ecotherapy work. And so this picture here is actually a friend of mine. So it's not a real client. She was pretending to be a client so I could get some pictures. But this is a place, this is back at Balcones National Wildlife Refuge, the little creek I was talking about. This is a place where I have worked a lot with clients. So she says we can see the therapist and environment as working together to create a containing space for the participant to work in. So just as we would build a container or create a container in our offices or with our energy or with our words or our tone of voice, we can also work with nature to create this containing space. So if this were, real client I was working with, perhaps I would have scouted out beforehand and felt like, oh, this would be the perfect space, I think, for this client who I'm seeing on Tuesday. I think this will be a good containing space for what I think that she might want to be talking about, or maybe it's just an intuitive feel that I think this would be a good space for, how to work with her this week. And then she says, outdoor therapy often involves being alongside someone. We are together in nature, our conversations taking place against the backdrop of our surroundings. And I love this part, crystallizing around shared points of attention. There's that nature as a democratic space. We're both experiencing this around crystallizing around shared points of attention. That bird flying in front of us, that's happening to both of us at the same time. This shared experiencing invites collaboration. It makes us, I think, more equal. It makes us both humans walking in this difficult life together, rather than me as the expert therapist who knows all about life. It makes us more on equal ground. Participants and therapists collaborate in investigating the scene in front of them, whilst therapists and environment collaborate to create the therapeutic container. And then she goes on to say about therapeutic attunement in nature. We think about it, to me this is so interesting because we are taught, or I was taught, of attunement as being more between two people, like trying to attune with your client. And but she brings nature into this, saying attunement is not just something which happens between people. When we go into nature, we may feel body resonance with the land around us. In a dark wood, we may feel gloomy and fearful. On a hilltop, we may feel exuberant and free. By a river, we may feel calm. The body's sense responds to cues from the environment with a feeling-based set of reactions and associations. So we'll talk a little bit more. We're going to unpack some of that a little bit more here in a minute. But this is another place that I don't work with clients a lot because it's kind of far away, but you can only imagine what this would be. This is at Lost Maples in the Texas Hill Country, a state natural area. And behind that great big boulder is the trail. You kind of a little bit see it coming around behind the rock. But imagine working with a client and you're thinking about attunement. there's so much in this picture right here. I mean, I'm standing or sitting like right next to the water. I probably have my feet in the water. It's really pleasant and beautiful. But we could also be sitting on top of this big boulder. We could simply be walking by along on the trail. And so thinking about, what is this body sense? What is the attunement for you in this different, this environment? Or working with clients, what are the feelings that are coming up? What is the feelings based types of, or the emotions that are coming up, or the body attunement? So you can, especially if you already work in that way, with somatic experiencing, or just work in a somatic kind of way, this will be familiar as far as that body attunement and what does this feel like to you. So then my own take, I was thinking about all these people who have been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I've learned all these things from reading their books and articles. And then I started thinking about, well, how is it that I work then with, in my own style, I guess, or with my own community here, which is going to be different from other, communities, perhaps. And I guess for me, what started to make sense was that I started thinking about, what is it like to co-lead a group with another person? Why would you do that, compared to not just leading a group by yourself? And for me, that helped give me some framework about how then do I bring nature in as a co-therapist? And so I started thinking with another person. Of course, the reasons in my mind, we each offer different gifts, insights and perspectives, experiences, ages, ethnicities, perhaps, whatever. But we bring in different sorts of qualities and energies. We hopefully have a mutual respect for each other and a respect for our knowledge and for our work. But then I think the exciting part is that once you start to work with someone, you start to develop this beautiful synergy, almost like a dance or something. You begin to maybe predict or anticipate what they're going to say or what they're going to notice in the group and that sort of thing. So in these same ways, I think we also can bring nature in basically in the same way. So you might keep these things in mind as I'm talking about like nature as a co-therapist. So first of all, and I think Linda, let me know at the end if I'm not explaining this correctly, but I think Linda calls this level 1 ecotherapy. I think of it as like basically the passive benefits, so that if I'm going out with somebody in nature, a client, or working in nature, even if for whatever reason I don't necessarily talk about the benefits, or maybe it's somebody who's not that comfortable being outdoors, maybe they haven't spent a lot of time outdoors, this is really hard for them. And so it may be that I don't necessarily talk about a lot of the deeper kinds of nature connection things, perhaps, but I know that passively, because the research, all this great decades of research tells us that there's still a lot of great stuff going on. I mean, that's intuitive too, of course. And so I can either explicitly bring that in, so nature is a co-therapist in the sense of nature provides all these benefits, like lowered blood pressure, calming the nervous system, on and on and on, as a way to provide psychoeducation to the client, if that feels appropriate. But if for whatever reason, maybe the client is really having an important session where they really need to talk a lot about, say, the trauma they've gone through or something. So maybe it doesn't feel appropriate for whatever reason to really even bring in the psychoeducation. But I still know, it's kind of like Ronan Berger talked about, you can also quietly just notice what's happening, and you can quietly contain, with the help of nature, you can quietly contain that space. And so you can also notice what's happening in nature as your client is talking as well. I think about this as a good way to begin, especially for clients who are uncomfortable outdoors, or worried about, around here, people are always worried about rattlesnakes and skunks and stuff if they're not used to hiking a lot or something. But this is a great first step into beginning to plant the seed for developing a deeper relationship with nature that's synergistic and reciprocal. And then attunement. Going back to the attunement, talking about nature as a co-therapist, there's the large scale feel of the attunement. So a sunny spring day What does that feel like? What kind of body sense does that bring up, or feelings does that bring up for your client? Versus in the middle of autumn bird migration or spring bird migration, where there's a lot of transitions happening. What does that feel like, and what does that bring up? Or an overcast day or a rainy day. So that's kind of like, for lack of a better way to say it, a large scale kind of feel. And then a smaller scale feel, as you're walking along, there's this beautiful big oak tree, or a deer walks by, or you're sitting and a beetle, walks by along a rock or a log. So right around you in that immediate space, what does that feel like for your client? And so a lot of times that's what in fact, that last point, noticing if anything seems to mirror a client's content or affect, you can either observe that for yourself and see if you notice anything, or more commonly, I'll just simply ask people, there's a lot that we can see and hear and the wind on our face. What comes up for you? What are you noticing? What catches your eye? And so see what the client says. It could be that big giant rock over there. It could be that beautiful tree. It could be whatever. Or if something actually enters the session, I don't mean something, but like an animal enters the session, that can be really fun to work with and see what comes up with that. And then the use of space. I will often, even if I've been to this particular park or trail or space, I will often scout ahead of time if I can, to explore how the different spaces feel, because they can feel different at different times of the day, depending on the angle of the sun, or different weather, or different times of the year. And so I like to really scout and scout and scout and scout, because then I can also start to get used to where are the different spaces. I start to be like, oh, this particular tree seems to be a great tree for so many clients, or this particular spot underneath this tree really seems to work well for people. So it's almost like it's very much like getting to know a friend. You get to know all the different spaces. As well, on a practical level, of course, you can figure out how long does it take you to get like along this trail. Does that fit with an hour or an hour and a half, or whatever session, however much time you have. And then remembering that, of course, different spaces are going to feel different for different clients. And just because this, say, oak tree feels really nurturing to you, it may feel oppressive or something to your client. So you do have to, as you're scouting and trying to become familiar with all these different spaces, just notice how you feel and what comes up for you, but don't automatically assume, of course, that that's going to be how it feels for your client. And then, so you can then pick spaces where you think that is going to support the therapeutic process for, say, an upcoming session, or you can allow your client to choose the space. That's your clinical decision making. You can get to the park, and then you can let the client say, hey, let's sit next to this tree, or let's sit here, or let's just keep walking. You can let that unfold organically, or you can specifically ask them, would you like to pick what we do today, or where we sit, or if we walk. And so these are the clinical decisions depending on what the client's going through, the particular person, whatever it might be. I once worked with a teenage client who always wanted to be up it was like a single track trail, and she always wanted to be first, and she always wanted to make the decisions. And so that was really interesting to work with. And for the most part, that was what we did. That was what seemed appropriate. But occasionally I would kind of test to see, well, hey, how about if we try going down this trail, just to kind of see what that brought up, or how she responded to that. If you let things unfold organically, which there's always going to be that, I think, in outdoor work anyway, you can notice how clients interact with different spaces. So you can notice where do their eyes tend to be absorbed, or where do they tend to go, as far as like where they might stop on the trail, or where do they tend to be drawn to, how they place themselves. So for instance, if you stop at a creek or something, or you stop for a drink of water, where is the client standing? Is the client way over there, or are they right up next to you, or as you're hiking along the trail, are they right up next to you? Are they nervous or something? So that's another way where this use of space, it's so much more dynamic versus like in your office where you've got a couch and the chair and the client sits there and you sit here. This is constantly moving and changing, allowing clients to move more freely. And so this is really useful for ongoing assessment. You can track where clients tend to go throughout the different sessions. And then again, we can't assume how a client perceives a particular space in nature or an experience with nature. We can't really assume how that is affecting them. I mean, that it's affecting them the same that it is for us. So as I was saying earlier, a hilltop might feel very freeing for one, but that might feel very exposed for another person, either for that person or for what they want to talk about or for what they're going through in their lives in that moment. An overcast day might feel very gloomy and quiet for one person, but I've had lots of clients who say, I love overcast days. They make me feel so calm. The sunny days, it's too bright. I've had many clients say that. And then, of course, the important thing is the collaborative exploration of how does this particular space or this weather or this tree or this beetle that just walked in front of us, how does that affect you as your client? And that's what's, of course, the really important, interesting, rich work. And then nature as I talked about a little bit, nature as a metaphor or a mirror or a teacher or a guide. And of course, this can get into a really, really rich area. And surprisingly, a lot of clients really work well. I say surprisingly because when I try to do similar kind of work in my office, it seems like I kind of meet more resistance. But something about being in nature, I think because we evolved in nature, this is our home. But whatever it is, this becomes, I think, a lot easier, it seems to me, for clients to be able to tap into metaphorical type of talk or mirroring or teacher. So working with a teenage client one time, we're sitting kind of like up on this big rock and there's a creek below us, and across the creek are these big giant boulders and trees. And I asked her, what is your eye? What do you notice? What absorbs your attention? And what she picked was this big boulder that was in between two other boulders. And the visual of it, they were kind of tilted, and it looked like the boulder she picked was being squeezed between these two other boulders. And so obviously that was super rich. And for assessment purposes, I mean, that spoke volumes. I think, I don't even know if we could have gotten to me understanding her experience, internal experience, in probably 6-8 sessions, because she was real walled, she had a lot of walls around her. But that helped her right away to be able to say, this is how I feel inside, through talking about that boulder. And then, helping clients to then create and nurture their own relationship with nature. I kind of explain it, or I think of it as how you might do this with another person, like a new person that you've met. You might first want to know their name, of course. Oh, where are you from? These sorts of conversations. I think of it in a similar way where, and Carol mentioned this earlier, which was exciting to me. I think that part of it, or at least in my work, a large part of that, also, especially in the beginning, because it's very kind of simple and neutral, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So you can start teaching a little bit of left brain learning. So like the names of some different plants and animals, you do not have to be a biologist. You don't have to know every plant and animal, but I think it's helpful to know a few of the names. This is a northern cardinal. This is a, mockingbird, or whatever it might be. Maybe know, a few things about the different plants and animals, so that you can begin to introduce your clients to this is the ecosystem that we're a part of here. This is where we live. This is our ecosystem. Here are some of the problems in our ecosystem. Like here where we live in Central Texas, we have problems with water, especially in those of you out west too, water is very precious. And so we can go through times of droughts, and this is hard. And so people start to fight about who's going to get to have what water, and are we going to run out of water, and they're taking, more water out of their well, and this kind of thing. And so we also, of course, have endangered species, and that's something that we can talk about. So depending on the client, the more you get to know about the plants and the animals and the ecosystems and what's going on in your ecosystem, the more you can integrate that in as you feel appropriate into the work that you're doing. And then the more kind of like right brain, affective, sort of sensory work, mindfulness and sensory awareness, that can be, something like getting to know nature around you in a more sensory, embodied, experiential kind of way. So to me, that left brain, right brain way can really begin to deepen and deepen and deepen people's relationship with nature. And then finally, reciprocity, I think, is, of course, important for all the work we do. I do this in all kinds of different ways. Most often, I keep it pretty simple. It might just be an internal word of thanks, or I might encourage my client to do that if that feels appropriate. Sometimes I get a little, creative, or just, I get a little idea that sparks. And so this one on the left, I found it online somewhere, and it was on a bird watching website. And these are just like chicken eggs, but you wash them out and sterilize them, I guess. Anyway, this is my dog's fur I brushed them and then put the fur inside of there. So I tried this with some different clients where it felt appropriate, where I thought they might find this meaningful. And basically I explained it as, in the springtime, in the early summer as well, the mother birds who are sitting, they've been sitting on their eggs, they become a little calcium deficient. So they start looking for sources of calcium. So you can crunch this egg up and crunch it, spread it on the ground. One of my clients was a gardener. She said, "Oh, this is wonderful. I do this anyway. I'm going to take this and crunch it and put it into the garden." And then the natural fur, versus like lint from your dryer, which is not so good, but the natural fur, the birds can pick up and line their nest with it, or that sort of thing. Incidentally, this is sort of strange and funny, but it's nature. The other day I was going for a walk, and I saw an ash-throated flycatcher come down, a type of flycatcher, go down to a little small deer that was dead on the road. It had been hit days ago. But I couldn't figure out what the flycatcher was doing, because that's they eat bugs and stuff. But it was pulling the fur off of the deer, and then it flew off with a whole bunch of fur in its mouth. So I think it was going off to the nest to put the fur in its nest. And so that's like a little, I'm not sure what the word is, sad, sad for the deer, but it was kind of interesting to see like the natural fur being used. So that's kind of the idea behind this. And then in the fall or in the winter, I'll switch over to these bark butter bites or bits, which is basically just kind of like nuts and cornmeal or something that you can throw out, and the birds like them, and the raccoons. And so the point of this, though, the reciprocity piece, you don't have to go to all this, sort of trouble. There's so many ways to do reciprocity, but the important part of it is that we're teaching our clients to also give back. So it's not just about us taking things from nature, like tranquility or comfort or whatever it might be. We're also giving back to nature. So that promotes our healing, but then it also promotes thinking about what nature is going through, what the environment is going through. And this ends up being a really wonderful, very deep piece of the work. And then finally, the last slide, a couple of just takeaway points. One of the things I talk about a lot in my trainings with therapists is, just as we're taught to trust the process in conventional therapy, when you start doubting if it's working, you're not sure to say, trust the process. I think we can apply this absolutely, that we can trust that nature will provide what only nature can provide when we're working with clients. So we go out along this trail or to this pond or whatever it might be, and there are going to be things, there are going to be experiences, animals or other types of experiences that only nature, that we cannot provide. We can provide that container. We can find the spaces. We can do our part of it and our work in it. But a butterfly flying by, I can't do whatever that butterfly is bringing up for that client. I can only be there to witness it and to notice my client and these sorts of things. So just as you would with a human co-therapist, I think then it's important when you're inviting nature to be a co-therapist with you, it's important to really share that time and space, especially when I think this is true for a lot of us. If you're new at this work, there's lots of anxieties that come. Am I doing it right? Am I walking too fast? What do I do? And so we start talking a lot, perhaps, or we think we need to have this technique or that technique, because it's hard when you're first starting doing something like ecotherapy that you don't really know quite how to do it, or you've read everything you can read, but now you're having your first session. I think it's important to really share that time and space with nature. So that means listening as best as you can to what nature's bringing up or noticing, giving silence. Silence is really important, I think, when you're working with people in nature, because the silence is also where nature's really going to step forward. That's been my experience, is when I get silent and I'm noticing or I'm tending to my breathing. If I'm feeling anxious, maybe I'm just going to tend to my breathing. But I really feel like it's important for there to be a space, because I feel like something is happening in nature, but I don't know what. A lot of times, if I just honor that silence and let it be there, nature will step forward with something. A client will notice something, they'll see something, or they'll have a memory will come up that turns out to be important. And so a final quote from Barry Lopez, one of my favorite nature authors, in Arctic Dreams. He says, "The land retains an identity of its own, still deeper and more subtle than we can know. Our obligation toward it then becomes simple, to approach with an uncalculating mind, with an attitude of regard, be alert for its openings, for that moment when something sacred reveals itself within the mundane, you know the land knows you are there." And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Amy.